Hegel's absolut. The German absolute is an adjective or adverb used in much the same ways as the English absolutely. It derives from the Latin absolutus, loosened, detached, complete, the past participle of absolvere, to loosen from, detach, complete, and thus means not dependent on, conditional on, relative to, or restricted by anything else, self-contained, perfect, complete. It first occurs as a noun in Nicholas of Cusa, who, in his De Docta Ignorantia, on learned ignorance, 1440, used absolutum to refer to God, as the being which is not conditioned by, limited by, or comparable to anything else, and German philosophers, after Kant, regularly used das Absolut to refer to the ultimate, unconditioned reality. This may, but need not, have the features, personhood, etc., traditionally associated with God. The account of the absolute that most concerned Hegel was that of Schelling, who, though an early adherent of Fichte's idealism, soon abandoned it in favor of the view that the absolute is a neutral identity that underlies both the subject, or mind, and the object, or nature, a view that owed as much to Spinoza as to Kant and Fichte. Hegel's response to Schelling and Spinoza is not to deny that the absolute exists. He was committed to granting that there is an absolute both by his belief that not everything is dependent on something else, and by his belief in God, for whom, on his view, the absolute is the philosophical expression, shorn of its anthropomorphic presuppositions. The question is rather what the absolute, or for that matter God, is. Unless we answer this question, the claim that the absolute exists is empty. In the preface to Phenomenology of Spirit, Schelling's absolute is described as the night in which all cows are black. His own view is this. A theory of the absolute postulates three types of entity. 1, the absolute. 2, the phenomenal world, rocks, trees, animals, etc. 3, human knowledge of one, of two, and of the relationship between them. But this schema invites several criticisms. 1. Neither Spinoza nor Schelling gives an adequate account of how or why the absolute generates the phenomenal world. They implicitly appeal to an outside observer to whom the absolute appears in various guises, an observer who is inconsistently treated both as responsible for the absolute's manifestation of itself and as merely one of the absolute's manifestations. 2. The absolute alone, 1, cannot be the absolute if it does not manifest itself in the form of 2 and 3. It is only the manifestation of the absolute that makes it the absolute, as it is only the development, ceteris paribus, of a tadpole into a frog that entitles us to classify it as a tadpole. So the absolute, 1, depends on its manifestations as much as they depend on it. Thus, 1 alone, since it depends on 2 and 3, is not the absolute is rather 1, 2, and 3 together. 3. The true nature of an entity is that entity's fully developed rather than its embryonic state, the frog rather than the tadpole, hence the true absolute is 1 as developed into 2, 2, and 3, rather than 1 alone. For the absolute, 1, is not epistemically absolute or unconditioned. Our knowledge of it is not, as Schelling's theory of intellectual intuition implies, immediate and unconditioned. It involves a long process of inquiry, both for the individual and for humanity as a whole. The absolute cannot remain simple and static, but must mirror the development of our knowledge of it, 3, since this knowledge is, by 3 above, not distinct from the absolute, but its highest phase. 5. The absolute in its original sense, 1, is superfluous, a proposition such as, the absolute is the substance, unlike the chef is angry, does not have a subject term that is intelligible apart from the concept we apply to it. So we may as well omit it altogether and concentrate only on such concepts as substance, concepts which we apply to the phenomenal world, 2, and to ourselves, 3, and which constitute the essence of these realms, since neither we nor the phenomenal world could exist unless such concepts were applicable to them. Hegel concludes that the absolute is not something underlying the phenomenal world, but the conceptual system embedded in it. Since this conceptual system is not static, but develops, manifesting itself both at successively higher levels of nature and in the advance of human knowledge over history, the absolute is not static, but developing, and reaches its final stage in Hegel's own philosophy. 6. What is absolute is not exclusively immediate or unconditioned, but has conditions and mediations which it sublates into immediacy. For example, philosophy, the highest phase of the absolute and itself absolute knowledge, depends on a certain natural and cultural environment. But it frees itself of this environment by, say, doubting its existence, by focusing on pure, non-empirical concepts, or by conceptualizing this environment. Similarly, human beings in general sublate the natural environment on which they depend by their cognitive and practical activities, spirit. Both for this reason, and because the conceptual system that structures nature and history forms the core of the human mind, the absolute is spirit. Hegel also uses absolute as an adjective. Phenomenology of spirit culminates in absolute knowledge in contrast to reason, spirit, and religion. Science of logic concludes with the absolute idea in contrast to life and the idea of cognition, and the climax of the whole Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, in Enc. 3, is absolute spirit in contrast to subjective spirit and objective spirit. Science of logic also refers to absolute difference in contrast to diversity and opposition, to the absolute ground in contrast to the determinate ground and the condition, to the absolute unconditioned in contrast to the relative unconditioned, to the absolute relation in contrast to the essential relation, the absolute and actuality, and to absolute necessity in contrast to formal and relative necessity. Usually, the item characterized as absolute comes at the end of a series of items. Absolute spirit comes after, and is in some sense higher than subjective and objective spirits. But this is not invariably so. Absolute difference comes before diversity and opposition, and the absolute ground comes before the determinate ground and the condition, suggesting that what is absolute is in some sense inferior to what succeeds it. This difference corresponds to a difference between two senses of absolute. In one sense, to be absolute is to exclude mediation and conditions, while in another sense it is to have sublated mediation and conditions. An uneducated child is absolute in the first sense, while an educated adult who sublates his education, perhaps by linguistic or scientific innovation, is absolute in the second sense.